Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Because Finding a Home Isn't Enough, Creating a Model of Care that Creates and Sustains Families, which is being offered as part of the ASAP Post-Conference webinar series that will be held the second Wednesday of each month through April of 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items related to today's webinar. First, you will notice a Zoom viewer button in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You can use this button to adjust the size of your webinar screen. Second, on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you will see the words questions listed. You can use the plus and minus button to open or close this box. If you have a question for Janice, you can enter it here. Time permitting, any questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And now I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Janice Goldwater. Janice is the founder and executive director of Adoptions Together, a Maryland, D.C. nonprofit agency that creates and utilizes the Successful Family Permanency Model of service. Founded 25 years ago, Adoptions Together has created permanency and enriched the lives of more than 6,000 children throughout the greater D.C. area. With a child and family-centered approach, the agency provides a holistic sense of attachment, focused, trauma-informed support and education to families and the professionals who serve them. Janice, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you everybody who has chosen to join in to learn more about the Successful Family Permanency Model. I'm really excited to spend the next hour with you to take a look at what we have created here at Adoptions Together after 25 years of practice. Because when we know that we've created an environment where families work together, that's when we know we can see positive outcomes for the youth that they're serving. And I think probably every one of us on this call is focused on permanency and challenged by the many things that come up as we seek to get children settled, not only in permanent families, but in families that are succeeding and hopefully thriving. I thought it would be nice if we began just by identifying who we are, because one of the things that is as we talk about this model and we talk about relationship, which is the key that underlies all of the work that we do here at Adoptions Together, is that we're seen. And it's interesting, thinking about webinars and how we learn and the critical importance of being seen, and the fact that I am seeing a screen. I have no body cues or clues to read off of, and you don't either. So here we're about to start, well, my brain saying, ooh, I want a relationship with these people I'm talking to, but I can't see you. So I'm going to know this really important thing. We're going to do a little survey to see just who's here. So I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to do this poll. It should come up on your screen, and you could just quickly oh, excellent. Let's see, we've got a few more of you, 82%. Come on, 18%. So 82% of those of us who are keyed in voted. And it's interesting because what that's showing us is that on this call, 67% of us identify as a caseworker or a therapist. 28% of us identify as an adoptive parent. None of us identify as a foster or guardianship parent. 11% of us identify as supervisors and 33% as administrators. Now I'm just going to come out of that. So it's interesting, you know, and I bet there's a number of us who go both ways. Um, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I started Adoptions Together in 1990. I am a master's level social worker with a background in clinical work, and saw there was such high overrepresentation of adoptees in my practice that I found I was interested in adoption. So, and tried to figure out what in the world was going on. Why are all these kids really struggling in families? So anyway, I started Adoptions Together after working in the world of adoption for probably about 7 years after starting out as a therapist in a general community mental health center, and saw there were some real gaps in the community. You know, in the 1980s and really into 1990, we had a problem in our community that healthy Caucasian infants, people were lined up to adopt, and everybody else went to foster care, and there was very few organizations that would welcome, embrace, and commit to serving every child who was in need of a family. So that was our origins. And I guess I'm going to a bit more about Adoptions Together, and I'm talking about myself, so sorry about that. I've been a licensed clinical social worker for 35 years. I have 4 children of my own. 3 were born to me. 1 was adopted. We adopted our 4th child in 2001 when our oldest, who was 18 at the time, went off to college. We had an opening in the family, so we thought, oh, we'll just bring in 1 more child. And so we adopted a 10-year-old. So we, at the time she came home, we were 10, 12, 16, and 18. She has been my best teacher, and she has led me to grow from a very seemingly thoughtful and competent social worker to a recovering social worker who has realized that being the client can be way overrated. So it's very easy to talk about a lot of these concepts and to deliver the services, but the really hard part, the really hard part is actually those people who are living it. So I feel so incredibly blessed. Have a lot. Well, I used to have a lot more gray hair till I did what many of us do when we start getting gray hair. It's been incredibly challenging and so rich, and I feel like the luckiest person in the world to know what I know today, and I'm here being able to talk to you about the critical importance of understanding attachment, trauma, and neuroscience. So honestly, this really excites me, understanding what's going on in the brain, why are people acting the way they are, what's behind the behavior. And it's led to my studying something called neuroleadership. And neuroleadership is a brain-based approach to understanding engagement in the workplace. And I have been doing this for about 3 years and actually run my organization based on these principles. And am completely inspired about this, and also in the context of a trauma-informed workplace, and I'm going to talk more about that. I live in Maryland, just outside of DC, and been here for about 35 years. I have 4 dogs, 2 cats, and my 24-year-old who lives, my youngest, who lives at home a lot of the time, has a bunny rabbit. So, as I said, I started the agency in 1990, doing starting with domestic infant, moving into international. Then we were blessed enough to be able to begin partnering with our local departments of social services. We've worked in the area of reunification with setting up a mentoring program for birth parents who are working on bringing their children home. One of the things that we know is that when people feel comfortable with one another, when someone's lived the experience of another person, the relationship gets enhanced. So we have recruited parents who have successfully reunified, and they walk alongside parents who are in the reunification process. We do adoption placement services. We work in Baltimore City. We have a very elaborate family finding program where we are going back, particularly for older youth, reconnecting them to families, working on those relationships. And that is incredibly exciting. All of the work that we do here at Adoptions Together is about building connections, because we know that building connections is the key to relationship. And so whether it's building connections of children to families, building connections within families, it's the primary piece of what we do. We also have a broad base of therapeutic services. We have a center in Washington, D.C., where we provide pre- and post-permanency services to anybody who's achieving or has achieved permanency through the Child and Family Services Agency, which is the D.C. department. And we've been doing this we've been working in partnership with them for about 9 years. We do a lot of training and education, and so we really embrace our community with therapeutic services. We work out of 5 different locations, although we have 4 offices. We have training for parents, behavioral health, substance abuse, school, and child welfare professionals. It's really exciting. Recently we have completed it and now are about to do a second cohort of 40 professionals who serve the child welfare community in Baltimore, both in these substance abuse and behavioral health communities, who are working with the child welfare population and providing training utilizing this model with those professionals. And you know, in our field, we often talk about the substance abuse professionals and the behavioral or mental health professionals. I am in that club that I think it's the same brain that reacts to whatever's going on. By some people, it's by using drugs. Other, it is different kinds of manifestations, but it's the same brain. And the more I am excited that as we move forward as a community, the more we can look at the integration of all these different pieces, the more effective I think treatment's going to be. I also do organizational consulting, both around the area and nationally. And we're licensed in Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and we're a nonprofit. So what is a successful family permanency model? Well, it's a holistic approach to the practice of creating and sustaining permanent families. It's a model that can be used in many different child family serving settings, and the kinds of settings in local departments of social services. We're working with homeless shelters. We're working with therapy practices. We're working with in the adoption arena. And it integrates the best practices relating to neurobiology, trauma, and attachment. And it's within the context of recognizing that reliable, ongoing relationships are the pivotal change agents, empowering people to feel positively about themselves and to engage productively with the world around them. The model is comprehensive in its composition and unique in that you're going to see as we go through that we use a lot of different evidence-based and promising practiced approaches. And as you know, and we've been working on this model, on sort of putting it all together and bringing it forward for the last year. It's not completely finished because the project that we're working on is creating a tool, because we would love to, our goal is to have a tool so we can say, okay, well, if this is presented, then this is the best intervention if this is presented, because there are so many new interventions that are becoming evidence-based. And for those of us who have been in the field for a number of years, we know that particularly in the area of attachment, there has not been the evidence that we hoped and needed for there to be. So as I said, the foundational elements include an understanding of the critical role of attachment, trauma, and neuroscience. So when I talk about neuroscience, I'm talking about the functioning of the brain with a focus on how it affects the central nervous system. So the Successful Family Permanency Model, again, looks at trauma, attachment, and neuroscience, and we really focus it on three different areas. One, the provision of clinical services. Clinical, by that I mean therapeutic services. We have a training component, and then the organizational structure. So we have, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about the model in relation to each of these areas. Okay, so starting with the clinical model, the therapeutic environment is seen as a safe haven. And for anybody who studies attachment, you know that the core of attachment is the, oh sorry, I had to just take a little drink of water. The core of attachment is the ability to feel safe in the context of a relationship. So anything therapeutically that's delivered is framed that the therapist or that has got to be the safe haven. It recognizes relationships as a central change agent. It recognizes the critical importance of the interaction of attachment, trauma, and neurobiology. Because what's happening in the brain is directly seen in the behavior. I think for me, one of the most exciting things about it being 2016 and about having this many years in the field is to have the science that's behind what we looked at theoretically for so many years. One of the things I love about studying neuroleadership and looking at what's happening in the brain, not from the perspective of treating pathology, but from the perspective of what is happening in our brain that results in how we feel and why we behave the way that we do. I find that that is just so incredibly helpful for understanding and managing all aspects of really both my personal and professional life. Our clinical model includes evidence-based and promising practice models. It also includes some of the old-fashioned models like 24/7 crisis intervention support in the form of a hotline. We've got some support groups that are not evidence-based. They're topical, coming of age groups. We have a chat and chew where families cook together and get support, and we have all kinds of specialized groups, and we also have general support for families. We have respite programs and those kinds of support groups. We have counseling and we have coaching, and what underlies it all is a culture where learning is constant. So some examples of the types of relationship-based interventions we used, and it was interesting, like as we've organized this and we've kind of gone back and forth, a lot of these interventions can be called attachment-focused, some can be called trauma-focused, but I thought I would just pick a few that we use and share them with you. One is the circle of security, and if you don't know about the circle of security, I highly recommend that you learn about it because it's a fabulous, fabulous intervention that's designed to enhance attachment security between parents and children. The circle of security, there's now a program that is where the model is delivered in groups, and there's a DVD and a nice curriculum, and they're working on making it evidence-based. I believe it's a promising practice, and it's incredibly helpful. Parents get to actually watch videos of other parents interacting with children and then analyzing it within the context of what's called the circle of security, which is how a child leaves and how a child returns to their safe haven. Another model that we use is Dan Hughes. He definitely impacts and has for a number of years our work. His dyadic developmental psychotherapy and then the attachment-focused family therapy. Dan and John Balin wrote a fabulous book called Brain-Based. Here they wrote Attachment-Focused Family Therapy, but they also wrote Brain-Based Family. If you just Google John Balin, B-A-Y-L-I-N, and Dan Hughes, it's fabulous to pull together. They pull together what's happening in the brain and how that directly impacts then what's happening between the parent and the child. Dyadic developmental psychotherapy is based on the premise that the development of children and youth is dependent and highly influenced by the nature of the child-parent relationship. This intervention focuses more on the adoptive population and foster care population and helping children and parents learn how to read each other's cues. But it's interesting, like Circle of Security was not geared necessarily for our population in mind. Circle of Security is an intervention that's delivered and effective for all parents, in my opinion. I think that they say it goes up to the age of 5 now, but it's just a fabulous teaching tool. Child-parent psychotherapy is another model that we use, and that was founded by Alicia Lieberman, and that is an attachment-focused intervention for children under the age of 6 also. We use PCIT, and that falls in both the trauma and attachment realms, but again, all of these interventions are teaching parents to be able to effectively read their children's cues. Another intervention that we use is Mary Dozier's ABC. Now what ABC stands for is the Attachment Biobehavioral Catch-Up. And Mary Dozier works out of the University of Delaware, and she began her research by studying cortisol and focused on children under 24 months, but found that when measuring children coming into foster care and then getting the intervention, their cortisol levels after getting the intervention drop significantly. And cortisol is a hormone that we give off when we when we experience stress. What I'm going to do after I do this presentation is post this on the Harmony website, and I'll write out attachment and biobehavioral catch-up. So sorry about that. We also use something called trauma systems therapy on both the therapeutic level and the organizational level, or the community level. And we were lucky enough in the DC area. DC got a grant to bring trauma systems therapy into our community. And so there's cohorts across the area who are providing the therapeutic service, this model, and it's about, it addresses both the individual emotional needs as well as the social environment where the children live. So it's looking at, it's got a clinical model, and it also has a community-based model, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We use trauma-focused CBT. We find that it has some limited application. Trauma-focused CBT is quite effective for people who have had situational trauma. Because so many of our clients have complex trauma, we find that they don't have the ability to engage in the way one needs to engage in this type of treatment. Dialectical behavioral therapy, Marsha Linehan's work. We do DBT groups. We teach principles of DBT. DBT teaches about emotional regulation. It teaches how to identify and come up with new strategies to manage one's emotional state. We call it SFCR, which is founded by Strengthening Families Coping Resources. There's a woman in our community I believe she's at Hopkins, named Laurel Kaiser. She created this model and has studied it and made it evidence-based, where we bring together families who have actively experienced trauma and we've got a curriculum, and it's done in a group setting, and it's an incredibly effective way of working with the family and working with the family within a group at the same time. And then finally on this list is Seeking Safety. And Seeking Safety is an intervention that was originally designed for clients with a history of trauma and substance abuse. It's a model that can be provided in a group or individual format, and it's got a lot of flexibility in its delivery of services. It's a delivery in the model. So in order to get to even be able to engage in so many of those different pieces, we have to have a brain that allows us to engage. So if we're feeling really stressed out or we're worrying about something, it's really hard to pay attention. If we have any kind of a social injury or anxiety, we often go to our limbic system, to our fight-flight, so we can't pay attention. And so many of the clients, and we can't engage in relationships, so many of the clients that we work with have a really hard time engaging parents and children. We see so many really extreme behaviors amongst the people we serve. So I think understanding what's happening in the brain, the sensory systems, is the key to even beginning to have a relationship. We think a lot about mindfulness, and we're not talking about anything except beginning with paying attention on purpose, and it's being aware of what's going on in this moment. The other night I had a bad dream, and I woke up and my heart was racing, and it was about my son, who is doing great. He's 32 years old, and everything's going well in his life as far as I know. Anyway, but I had this dream that something bad happened to him, and I woke up, and for anybody knows what that's like, it's a very unpleasant experience. But before I jumped up, I thought, okay, this was just a dream. Everything's okay. I felt the sheets around me. I looked around the room. I reoriented. I got back and thought, wow, that was a scary thought. Now I'm going to go back to sleep now because I know he's just fine. That was an example of having a feeling and then paying attention to it and using my ability to think, bringing it back. For some people, when they get a big feeling, they don't have the capacity to bring it back down. And for us, depending on how big that feeling is, if our midbrain completely takes over our prefrontal cortex, there's no chance we're going to be able to think. So anyway, all of the interventions that we're going to talk about and focus on have to do with emotion regulation. So I mentioned DBT, Marcia Linehan's. It's the standard, when she developed it for the borderline personality adult population, those diagnosed with that, and for people who had a self-harm problem, who resisted most kinds of treatment. And it's really, if you haven't read about dialectical behavioral therapy, I highly recommend reading about it because it's very, very useful, and there's so many principles of it that can be integrated into our work. Another is Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. By learning to recognize what's going on in our bodies, Bessel van der Kolk recently wrote that book that said the body keeps the score, and Peter Levine's work is sort of the foundation of learning, the basic beginnings and simplicity of being in the moment, and then recognizing how what we're holding in our body is influencing how we're experiencing the moment. The work of Pat Ogden for sensory motor psychotherapy, again, looks at what's happening in the body and how that affects how we're thinking, how we're in relationship, and it's just by recognizing what's going on in the body, and giving the individual the tools to understand and changing the environment, it significantly impacts understanding in a much more productive way. The FASD is something that is really interesting to me because as a matter of a personal disclosure, my own child who experienced significant maltreatment early on in her life, all of the work that we did for the, and was extremely reactive, all of the work that we did for a number of years was attachment focused, trauma informed, and of course we didn't have evidence. The evidence wasn't there. Remember, we started working intensely in 2001, and in many ways there was so much that got healthier about her, but there was so many things that were still really difficult. And I really questioned myself as a parent, and just worked kind of extra hard to figure out what's missing. What is missing? What do we need to be doing differently so we have different kinds of outcomes? And it wasn't until she was 21 that I came upon Diane Malbin's work, which is Diane Malbin has an organization called Facets, F-A-S-C-E-T-S. It's facets.org, and I can also put that on this PowerPoint. But she has a neurobehavioral approach. It's a brain-based approach to working with people who have been exposed both to alcohol and other substances that's changed the way the brain has developed. And it was when I began to look into this that I realized, oh my goodness, we missed this really big piece. We missed this really big piece. So much of the won'ts were probably can'ts. So there was a lot that if I knew what I know now, that I would have done really differently with my child. And I feel so blessed to know what I know now and to be able to not only relate to her differently, which is creating some different outcomes, but also to share that with you, that whatever it is that we're doing, we've got to figure out what is happening within the brain so we can make sure we're not asking people to do things that they're not capable of doing. One intervention that is particularly good with this population, or with kids that have had neurobehavioral differences, is the ALERT program, and you can find that at the Therapy Works, and that is a program that teaches kids about emotion regulation, and it's done in a group setting. Another that we like is the DIR Floor Time by Stan Spam. Many of us probably have studied with or heard of Dan Siegel. If you haven't, he's another person who I think has just been revolutionary in the world of not just mental health, but all aspects of how we function together as a society. And he came out with something called interpersonal neurobiology a number of years ago, which pulls together many different areas to look at how is it that we connect brain to brain. And so this was a quote that I really like from him. He says, by combining the exciting new findings of, is that human awareness, because there's nice little screens in my way, We can shape the connections in the brain towards integration together with the knowledge of how interpersonal relationships shape our brains throughout the lifespan. And I love this. We can actively inspire each other to rewire our internal and interpersonal lives toward integration. We can inspire each other to rewire. So how we connect, our brains are connected all the time. If I'm nasty to you, you're going to have a reaction because your brain is programmed to react to keep you safe. So knowing that what you do matters to those you're sitting with right now, those who you're about to see, whatever role you're in, and you can change it, is incredibly powerful. So how do we then take all these pieces and take them into the workplace? We talk about a trauma-informed workplace, a trauma-informed system of care, and I think it's just as important for us to think about what we're doing within our organizations as what we're doing with the clients, with the clients that we're serving. I've seen situations where people are really nasty to each other, and then we expect them to walk in the workplace, and then we expect them to walk out and do something really hard. And we have so much pressure in our workplace to perform. We, just like our clients, have to find a way to measure, a way to manage all of the different stresses and information that's coming in so we can take care of one another in a way that we want others to take care of others. I mentioned earlier that I study neuroleadership, and neuroleadership is the neuroscience of collaboration and engagement. Looks at the brain as a social organ and how to use this science to engage our teams to maximize performance. There's a fabulous group called the Neuro Leadership Institute out of New York City and on their website, they've got some really fascinating materials. One of the things I say is do unto others as you want others to do unto others. So how I treat my staff as an executive director directly impacts how my supervisors are going to treat their staff, and each level down, which comes down straight to the clients we're serving. If we want to treat our staff and ourselves to treat our clients with respect, we need to treat one another with respect. And it's sort of like, I think one of the gifts of being a consumer, we Goldwaters have consumed many different types of services, and gotten the gift, which doesn't feel like a really nice gift, of walking into all kinds of settings and being treated in all kinds of different ways, is the understanding of the critical importance of how it feels to even walk in an office. My daughter went to a therapeutic school, and when I used to go there as a parent and sit for the appointment in the waiting room, the clinicians would walk by and nobody would look up, and we were like invisible, and it just felt so uncomfortable, and I felt like I didn't even exist as a human being. And the contrast of that, a couple years later I came back to do some training for their staff, and it was like, oh, Mrs. Goldwater, we're so happy you're here to train, you smart, important, valuable person. And I really do think that had I been treated that way, like I mattered, when I was really in the trenches with a very struggling child, it could have gone a long way to really helping manage all the things I was managing. So what do we do to try to change our organizational culture? One thing is there's a book called Quiet Leadership. David Rock is the author of that, and he actually is the person who founded the Neuro Leadership Institute. Quiet leadership is a book all about leadership, and it breaks it down nice and simple, looks at the brain as a social organ, talks about some really fascinating things like if you do an MRI and look at the pain centers that light up when we're physically hurt, well, when we have social injury, those same pain centers light up within the brain. And so understanding those different types of social injury and recognizing them and looking how they then impact in the workplace and things we can do to work around them, because we can't change. Our brains are wired to survive. And even though it's really annoying that I got nervous before I did this today because I know this content really well, it's like, okay, brain, I hear you. You're doing your job. You're doing your job because your job is to keep me safe and to survive. The more we can learn about these kinds of things, the more we can say, okay, I know what's going on, and then we can get back to the business of what we're trying to do. So that's a fabulous book. And what we have is we have our management team reading the book. We do a chapter or a section each month and then take it back in our teams. And so we have a whole learning collective around that. Many of us have been trained specifically through online training in this area, and it's incredibly helpful. Another thing is the trauma systems therapy. As I said, in DC, we have the gift of having a citywide initiative, and so we look at how we can communicate organizationally from one organization to the next to wrap around the needs of the families and children that we're serving. Another model that's incredibly helpful is reflective supervision. And reflective supervision is a model of supervision that trains the supervisor to maximize the relationship with the supervisee and has a strong reflective component. I highly recommend learning about reflective supervision. And again, I come back to Dan Siegel and his interpersonal neurobiology. So then we get to our training. So our training programs provide structure, information, guidance, and resources for families, professional, and systems. You can make years ago, we did a great training on FASD for parents, and so the parents got all this great information, but none of the professionals serving them knew about it. And so it doesn't do much good if we don't get the whole community and the whole system. We've all got to be on the same page. And so all of the training that we do approaches relationship through a permanency confident lens and provides the tools to build and sustain successful permanent families. So things we think about is how we train is important as what we're training on. We know that if we are not in relationship with people that we're training, we don't have any credibility, we're going to lose them, and we're not going to be effective. Creating a safe learning environment and using principles of adult learning is really critical. That's my attempt to creating a safe learning environment was that nice little survey, which didn't really do it for me. I don't know if it did it for you, but maybe by my sharing with you a little bit about my background helped you at least understand the lens and the context to which I was coming to you. Knowing your audience is critical. And also the language of the training, making it for cultural competency. And it's just been fascinating. I said we finished training a cohort of 40 professionals who serve the child welfare community, and there was a mixture of people who work in a homeless shelter, people who work in outpatient mental health center, people who work in domestic violence, people who work in substance abuse treatment. So we brought together people of all different levels coming from different backgrounds, and we had this robust 6 full-day training for them. And it was just really fascinating how much our trainers had to adapt the language that they used to help build the community that they did. And in the end, the feedback was incredibly positive. One of the things we do is study the outcomes of every single thing that we do. And And we were concerned coming into it, how are we going to bring this vast group of people together and come up with something that everyone can understand? And with profound sensitivity, you can do that. Our training is comprehensive. Everything we do has the underpinning of connection. And also being present, that as we train, we know we need to be present and we need to be mindful to be in the moment, to feel I can't tell who's sleeping on the other end, I can't tell who's doing their email, I can't tell who's sitting on the edge of their seat. If we were in the same room, we would absolutely, I'd be watching the entire time for cues as to what was going on with you. So topics cover a variety of subject matter relating to permanency, parenting, personal growth, and include the unique issues of our population. And of course, the attachment, trauma, neuroscience underlie all we do. So, just to summarize, our model looks at, sort of the interaction between, we know when an infant is born, they're born with a brain that is not fully developed. We know that the brain develops in relationship to how the child's cared for. And so, we see the attachment into the neuroscience, goes straight across. We know that trauma impacts the attachment relationship. We know that trauma impacts the brain. We know that trauma changes the brain. We know that failed attachment changes the brain. We know that substances ingested in the environment, the prenatal environment, directly impacts how the brain is developing. So, and we know what happens after we're born in the environment, how it impacts all aspects of our health. So we think about this in a very holistic manner. So in order for parents and professionals to understand and connect with the kids, they have to understand what's happening in the child's brain as well as their own brain, and the psychoeducation is critical for empathy and connection. I spend a lot of time on Facebook groups, reading parent support groups, the ones that I tend to go in more than others, just, for not a great reason, well, except I'm interested, is, well, I guess that's a great reason, is the reactive attachment, and also the FASD. And it's just so, we see so many parents who just so honestly say they feel like their kids are so intentionally driving them crazy. Their kids are intentionally trying to blow things up. And it just, over and over again, I see parents who are completely exhausted because trying to raise a child whose brain is working differently just is incredibly exhausting. And so the more parents can not only begin to understand what might be going on in their child's brain, but understand their own brain, understand what happens when they get tired, when they get stressed, in terms of their own capacity to respond to the needs of their child, have empathy and connection, or not, is just really critical. This, is it a can or it won't? It's so incredibly important. And if there's one thing that you leave here today with, it's thinking about, and when you think about the people that you're working with, is it a can't or a won't? We're so conditioned to thinking that if we just pull up our bootstraps, we can do almost anything. I mean, if we look at who's running for office and getting a lot of votes, don't want to call anybody in particular, the message is anybody can do it. Anybody can do it. But the truth is some people don't have the boots to pull up. They have no bootstraps to even pull up. Their brains might be working differently. Maybe the right and the left side of the brains aren't talking to each other. Maybe the limbic system is so sensitive that the slightest facial expression, breath, sound, smell is going to send them right over the edge. Maybe they can do it today, but they can't do it tomorrow. So the capacity issue is so important. And, for years, I thought that in my own family, that my own child, because of the disrupted attachment experience she had, which was, very difficult, I thought that was like the biggest problem that underlied it all. Recognizing that there was a huge cant in there just has changed things so significantly, and I see it all over the place. Our therapists work from the point of looking at what's going on in the brain. What does this brain need to do to make this event happen or to do this behavior? And can this person do it? So if it's a can't, how can you help? Something we focus a lot on. What kind of accommodations do we need to make? How do we need to change the lens of what it is that we're trying to accomplish? How is it that we provide direct services? How do we use these models that have expectations when our clients aren't cooperating? How do we deal with clients that we talk about that they resist what we're doing? Well, is it that they resist it, or that there's something going on in their brain that's saying, brain, be safe, you can't change, because it takes less energy for our brains to do what they know than it is to do something new. So our brains are going to do what takes less energy just naturally as a part of survival. So there's so many different pieces to think about, and a lot of our education and the work that we do focuses around this. What do we do? How do we know if it's a can't or a won't? And then what can we do to help? So finally, I wanted to talk about the goals and the core components of our model. One, it's to sustain permanency in successful families. Of course, we want to decrease the rates of disruptions. We know that every time a child moves, it sets them back. It creates new neural pathways in their brain about how to get out of relationships. We want to decrease traumatic incidents of child abuse and neglect with at-risk families. We want to increase the knowledge of a model that provides integrated treatment for working both on PTSD and substance abuse concurrently. So many of our children come into care because of substance abuse, and so many of we still see the substance abuse community working in a silo that's just focusing on the behavior, and not that maybe that substance is a way of medicating oneself, because being in their own body is too overwhelming. And so this is a way of being able to manage, and then there's all of that work that needs to be done to help their brain repair so they can be in their body without using drugs. We strive to increase emotion regulation capacity for all family members. It's not just those kids. It's not just those kids. It's the entire family. Decrease child's challenging behaviors that interfere with school success. And of course, lowering stress. We want to create and sustain healthy attachments with at-risk families, birth, foster, guardianship, adoptive. Create and sustain healthy relationships between our birth and our foster, guardianship, adoptive families. That's such a challenging relationship, and we spend a lot of time working around that relationship between, it's the between these families that bring so many different pieces. And if you think about it from an attachment, trauma, and brain-based approach, all of the different pieces that we're bringing into one mix. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. Increased understanding of issues associated with adoption, foster, and guardianship. That's why we call it permanency competent. One time we called it adoption competency, but now we work towards permanency, because we know that there are some issues that are associated just with adoption, some with foster care, and some with guardianship and kinship, and we think it's important to really embrace and acknowledge all of those. And then increase parental knowledge and skills to effectively parent a child who's experienced trauma. A piece is that I think is really important to all of us is to increasing the knowledge of how to choose a successful intervention and a modality for traumatized families and children. And that's something that we're actively working on, creating our tool now and being able to measure that. Because there's so many things out there, and sort of how do you know what to do? How do you know who to refer to? How do you know what's the best treatment for the client you're trying to serve? Increased child-serving systems understanding of the important interplay between trauma, attachment, and neuroscience. We've had the the gift of being able to, recently spoke to judges and to be able to get into their training, but we get the lawyers, and we need to get all the different players. I mean, it's not just us clinicians and child welfare, social worky sorts that need this training. We need to get it out in the community, out into the school, and anybody who interacts with the kids that we're focused on. The other piece is to increase understanding of the impact of vicarious trauma on professionals. For any of us who have worked in this field, we know that we're witnessing some really difficult things. For the parents that are raising children who were hurt, we're witnessing some really difficult things. For the parents who were hurt themselves, we're witnessing some really difficult things. Vicarious trauma is real. It needs to be acknowledged, and we spent a lot of time focusing on that. We work on increasing knowledge and strategies for a successful and healthy organization and work atmosphere with maximum staff engagement. Not only do we want to do no harm by people getting vicarious trauma, because we lose people from the field all the time when they experience vicarious trauma, we need to learn how to, by studying the social brain, we need to learn how to maximize people's engagement by understanding the brain science. And then, of course, to increase the child serving systems awareness strategies to collaborate effectively with other child serving agencies. So, in the end, if you leave here knowing that what you do matters, that you make a difference, that how you treat people directly matters, and we all make mistakes all the time. And when we make a mistake, we say we're sorry, we reflect upon it, and we work on repair. There's so much of what we can do as professionals and parents to shape and guide the lives of others. If you have any questions or you want to know more about anything that I've spoken about today, feel free to reach out, send me an email, call me. I'm happy to talk more about this topic with you, answer any questions, and support you in any way that I can. And I thank you so much for investing this hour in learning more about this topic. So I think here we are at 2:58. So I'm going to turn it right back. See to my friends at Harmony.
Yes, Janice, that's perfect. Thank you. That was great. We hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. Our sincere thanks and appreciation to Janice for taking the time to present on such an important topic. As a reminder, all of the webinars have been recorded and are available on Harmony's website at www.harmonyfamilycenter.org. Please plan to join us at 1 Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday, March the 9th for the next ASAP post-conference webinar entitled Adoptive Family Camps, Connecting, Healing, and Having Fun, which will be presented by Pam Fry, Adoptive Parent and Chief Program Officer at Harmony Family Center. Until then, take care and have a great rest of the week.